Hi everybody, welcome back to Getting to Know Hue, and this month it's all about blue. We're focusing on the color blue this month, so you will need fabrics number 1, 2, 3, and you will need 27 for your background pieces. So gather up those fabrics and we'll get right into the cutting. So we're going to start off with color number 1, and we want to cut 1 2-inch times width of fabric strip, which we will then subcut down, and 2 3 7/8 by width of fabric strips. And I know when we start talking about cutting eighths, 5/8 or 6/8 or 7/8, everyone wants to know, can we round that up to 4 inches and just cut 4 inches and then trim it down later? But the block that we're going to use this 3 7/8 inch strip for isn't going to lend itself well to squaring up later. So you would be better to just go ahead and just take your time and cut 2 3 7/8 inch strips times width of fabric. Now, this month, I am starting off with a brand new blade in my rotary cutter, so that also helps make a big difference. The 2-inch strip, we're going to cut that into 16 2-inch squares. And if you're following along in the book, she calls every month, she labels every 2-inch square as a B square, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to label this B1. So it's a B square out of fabric number 1. We'll label this B1 and put it off to the side. From the 3 7/8 inch strips, we're going to cut 32 3 7/8 by 2-inch rectangles. So you're just going to take that strip and cut it into 2-inch segments. And then take what's left over, save it for another month. Now we're going to label these D rectangles. So we're going to call these D1 and pop them off to the side. Now, fabric number 2, we are actually going to cut this. The instructions call for using a fat quarter, but this is not a fat quarter. It's 3/8 of a yard. So there's more than a fat quarter here. So the strip cuts change just a little bit. So what we want to do is we want to have 1 2-inch strip times width of fabric and 2 3-inch strips times width of fabric. So we'll go ahead and cut that up. So we want a 2-inch and 2 3-inch times width of fabric. There, so we have 1 2-inch times width of fabric and 2 3-inch times width of fabric. We're going to subcut the 2-inch strip into 16 2-inch squares. And the 3-inch strips, we're going to cut them into 16 3-inch squares, and then we're going to subcut them on one diagonal. So let's go ahead and do the 2-inch strip, cut that into 16 2-inch squares. There we go, 16 2-inch squares. Take the rest of the fabric, save it for later, because you just never know when you're going to need a little piece of blue. And let's label these B2. So a B square, fabric number 2. And we'll put that off to the side. Now the 3-inch strips, we're going to cut those into 16 3-inch squares. So that's our next step. Now from these 16 3x3 squares, we're now going to cut them on one diagonal. And remember, when we were cutting on the diagonal, you want to make sure that you're right at the tippy tip here and the tip right there, and go ahead and cut them. So you're going to end up with 32 triangles, and we're going to label these C triangle. So there'll be 32 of those, then we can pop them off to the side, and we're ready to cut our last color of fabric. Now, quite often when I'm cutting such a large number of squares on the one diagonal, I like to cut a couple of layers at a time instead of just doing singles. I do find that the more layers you have, the less accurate it starts to become, even though they're piled right on top of one another, just because of the way the ruler kind of wobbles a little bit when you get too many layers. So I try to keep it to about, 2, maximum of 4 when I'm doing this kind of cutting. Now we're ready to cut color number 3. The cutting instructions in the book are a little bit bizarre. It's telling you it wants you to cut it on length of fabric as opposed to width of fabric, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and we're going to cut one strip 4 3/4 times width of fabric, one strip 2 5/8 times width of fabric, and one strip 2" times width of fabric. I'm sure that this was written the way it was for better use, for probably best use of the fabric, but there's still better use of the fabric. So go ahead and cut one 4 3/4, one 2 5/8, and one 2" strip, all with the fabric. From the 4 3/4" strip, we're going to go ahead and cut four 4 3/4" squares. We're going to label those A and stick them off to the side. From the 2 5/8" strip, we're going to cut 16 2 5/8" squares. Now from your strip, you should be able to get about 14 of those. So from the leftovers of the 4 3/4" strip, we can just go ahead and cut two 2 5/8" squares. Now, if you only manage to get 12 2 5/8" squares out of your strip, then go ahead and cut four of this one. But from my strip, I managed to get 14 2 5/8" squares. So here, I'm just going to cut two more 2 5/8" squares out of my leftovers from the 4 3/4" strip. Then I will take the rest of that strip and put it away for future use. I'm going to label these E as in Edward squares and put them off to the side. And lastly, we are going to cut the 2" strip into 16 2" B squares, and we're going to label these B3 and put them off to the side. From your fabric number 27, if you pre-cut the frame pieces last month, like we kind of talked about, you're going to need 8 of the 13" and 8 of the 16" strips. So kind of just grab them, put them off to the side, and then we'll finish cutting our background. Now last month we had a 5 1/4" strip left over and a couple of 3" pieces. Don't cut into those for this month. Save them. We're going to use them in another month. So put them back into the bag. We are going to cut two 2" strips and one 4 1/4" strip of your background fabric. From the 2" strips, we're going to cut 32 2" squares, and from the 4 1/4" strip, we're going to cut 8 4 1/4" squares. So there's our next step. Let's cut 32 2" squares and 8 4 1/4" squares. So let's go ahead and cut 32 2" squares and 8 4 1/4" squares. Now with this month, in our study of the color blue, we are going to be making 4 blocks. Every other month, from every other color, we make 2 blocks, but from the blue, we make 4. So let's get started with that sewing. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a 4 patch out of these colors. And we're going to do 16 4 patches. So what I'm going to start by doing, you want to put those together and those together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to my sewing machine. We have 16 of these, 16 of these, and 32 of these. So I'm going to sew all 16 of these together. I'm going to sew all 16 of these together, and then I will go to the ironing board and I will then press them, and I'm going to press them towards the dark, and then I'm going to go ahead and finish off the 4 patches. So that's my step, 16 of these together, 16 of these together, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit the ironing board. So off to the sewing machine. So here I am back from the sewing machine. I chain pieced all my pieces together. So now I'm going to head over to the ironing board and I want to press all of these towards the darker fabric, so that everything is going to be pressed towards the blue. And then we'll make our 4 patches. Okay, here I am back from the ironing board. Now if you pressed everything towards the blue, then you will end up with opposing seams, because now we're going to turn these into 4 patches. And when you're doing the 4 patch, you want to make sure that when you lay it out, you have the whites across diagonal to each other and the darks diagonal to each other. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to make 16 4 patches. I say if you line them up, or if you iron them so everything went towards the blue, you will have nice little opposing seams. So that's our next step. Turn these into 16 4 patches. So back to the sewing machine. Now take these back to the ironing board. Now with these 4 patches, it doesn't matter which way you press the seam allowance. You can press it just off to the side like this, because the parts that it's going to go up against, there's no, you don't have to worry about opposing seams because it's going up against straight pieces of fabric. So sometimes what I really like to do on a 4 patch is to press it this way, where I'm pressing all the seams kind of in a circle, and then I end up with this cute little 4 patch here in the center, and it makes for a very flat seam. But to be able to do that, what I need to do is take my 4 patch, and there's a couple of little stitches right in there. I don't know if you can see those. Couple of little tiny stitches right there, and what I will do is just undo that 2 little stitches right there, and then I can go to the ironing board and I can press this in a circular motion. It gives me a very, very flat seam right there in the center, and you end up with something that looks like a little weenie 4 patch on the inside. So I would press it this way, and that makes for a very flat block. So you might want to give that a try, or you can just press them normal. So once you get those pressed, just take those and put them off to the side. And now we're going to grab our D rectangles. And for these, what we need to do is cut them on an angle, and we need to make lefts and rights. And we need an equal number. So we need 16 lefts and 16 rights. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. The basic premise that we're going to use is you're going to take from the top of your D rectangle, you're going to measure down. Let's just open that up a little. So from the top of your D rectangle, right here, you're going to measure down 2 inches. Now I'm using my board to measure my 2 inches. I've measured it, and my grid here on my board is fairly accurate. So I'm going to line the top of my D rectangle up against here. I'm going to go down to the 2 inches, and then I am going to lay my ruler down right here at the 2 inch. So my ruler's right at that 2 inch, and then I'm right here at the tippy tip, and I'm going to cut that off like that. And then this is, just discard that. You don't need that. So this gives me the angle with the point on the right hand side. I also need 16 with the left hand side. So if I want to do this just a little bit faster, other than having to do 16 this way and then 16 the other way, if I line them up so that I have 2 pieces, and I'm lining them up wrong sides together. So I've got this one down underneath, and then this one on top, and they're lined up exactly on top of one another. And I've got them lined up here on my grid right at the top. I'm going to measure down 2 inches. I'm going to line the ruler up right there with the 2 inch. So I'm right here at the 2 inch mark. I'm right here at the tippy. And I cut. This will give me 1 left hand and 1 right hand. So every time I line the pairs up, wrong sides together like that, I'm going to get 1 of each. So that would be a slightly quicker way to do it, and you're cutting the left and the right hand at the same time. But the most important thing is to have them lined up like this. Otherwise, if you line them up on top of each other, right sides facing up, you're just going to be cutting one direction. Where if you line them up this way, you're cutting 1 of each at the same time. So use whichever method makes you happy, whether you want to cut 1 of each at the same time, or you're going to cut them all singles. So if you are cutting singles, you need to do 16 this way and 16 this way. If you are doing them doubles with wrong sides together, you're going to do 16, and that will give you pairs, and then you'll separate them out. Just like that. So whichever way you want to do it, cut up all of those, and you will end up with 16 lefts and 16 rights. Now, once you get these cut, bring those 4 patches back in, and we also want the 2-inch squares of fabric 3. And we are going to make the corner blocks. So you're going to start with a 4 patch, and we want one of these, and one of these. This is the cornerstone of the block, and we want 16 of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to piece these 2 together, sew this together, and then we'll sew these together kind of in a weird little 4 patch. So when you're sewing this together, you're going to line up the edge here perfectly, right on top of one another, like so. And you're going to sew down here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're going to do the same thing here, line these up perfectly, one right on top of the other, and sew here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to hit the ironing board, and then we're going to come back and sew this into a 4 patch. So here's our next move. Let's go to the sewing machine. So 16 blocks this way, 16 this way, and make sure that when you're sewing this, that the lighter blue is down in the right hand corner. So off to the sewing machine. Alright, here we are back from the sewing machine. I'm going to go off to the ironing board. Now when you're pressing these, you want to make sure you press these with opposing seams. So I chose to press the bigger part towards the border or the edge, and this one is going to be pressed this way. So do all your pressing where you're pressing towards the rectangle D. So this will get pressed this way, this will get pressed this way, and then we'll have opposing seams. And then after that, we are going to line these up and sew those together to create our little corner block that looks like this. So give them a press, then back to the sewing machine and finish sewing this part of the block here. Now the next step is to take this unit that we've already got made, and you are going to take a triangle and put them, put one here and here. Now so what we're going to do here, make sure you have right sides together, and we're going to flop that little triangle over there, and just make sure that the point is lined up right here, right where that seam lies. And you got your raw edge here lined up, and you got the point lined up there, and we're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So do that on all 16 of your pieces, and then we will be back. We'll press that, then we'll put on the second triangle, but we need to get this one on and pressed first. So back to the sewing machine. Now when you're sewing this on, you should also have a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch sticking out. So where these two seams meet, that is where my 1/4 inch seam is going to be. So you should have equal sticky outy here, and that point should be lined up right there. And then once you get that done, off to the ironing board, and we're just going to press this over. So when you get those done, come back from the ironing board. We're now going to take another one of the triangles, and we're going to put it on this edge right here. Now you want to make sure that your point is pointing right there. You're lined up on the raw edges, and you will have about a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch here. That will be where your seam is. Now, take care and make sure that you put these on this end of the block, because they will also fit on that end of the block. It makes for a totally different block, and it's very pretty, but we want to make sure we're on the right edge. So you're going to be on this end of the block where the darker fabric is. So go ahead, do that, line those up, on all 16 and then back to the ironing board. And we're back. I also pressed this seam allowance towards the triangle. All right. So now our next step is to bring these blocks in, and we are ready to start assembling our block. So we're going to take the centerpiece right here and line it up. Oh, maybe you can't see that very well. Like this, and like this, and like this, and here, and then we take one of these and put it in between, like so. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew these three together like that. We're going to sew these three together, and we're going to sew these three together. So when you flop this one over, you want to make sure that your raw edges here are all lined up, and this seam right here will naturally be the 1/4 inch away. So don't try to line them up here. You want them to be offset just a little bit so that when you are a 1/4 of an inch down, that's where your lines will meet. Okay, so that's our next step. Go ahead and sew these three together, these three together, and these three together. Then a quick press, and we are almost done our block. And here we go, back from the ironing board. Now I pressed this seam allowance in towards the block. I pressed these seam allowances out this way and these seam allowances out that way, so that when I sew my blocks together, I'm going to have opposing seams. I'm going to sew this to this and this to this, and then we are done putting the block together, and all that will be left will be to put the frames on. So now you're going to grab your frames. Now the frames are cut to 13 inches. My block is finishing up at 12.5 inches. Oh, I got a little bit of fluff there. I don't like that. So my block is finishing up at 12.5 inches. What I really should do to make this so that at this late stage in the game I'm not going to end up with a wonky block is to take my two 13-inch borders, cut them to 12.5, then pin center to center, edge to edge, and make sure I sew them on evenly. Then we'll press those and we will cut the final borders. So that's what I'm going to do. I want to make sure that I don't at this point make my block wonky. So I am going to cut these to the size of my block. Now you would cut them to the size of your block. If your block is not 12.5, you will cut it to whatever size your block is. So take a measurement of your block, cut these to that size, and then we'll go ahead and sew those, one on the top and one on the bottom. So back to the sewing machine. And there we go. That is the 12.5 side done. Now I'm ready to sew the 16-inch side on. And they just fit beautifully. So I don't have to do any subcutting on here. So I'm going to sew a 16 to the top and to the bottom of this block now. And then we can trim that up to the finished size of 14 3/4. So sew this on and this on, give it a press, and then come on back and we will square this up to 15 1/4. Now, I shortened this strip up on purpose, so if you find that your 16-inch strip isn't long enough, don't worry, because we're still going to cut these down to 14 3/4. So if your strip isn't quite long enough, that's okay. Just sew it on. Best would be to sew it center to center so that you'd have a little bit left at each end. But either way, you're going to be fine. So my block finished up at 12.5 rough. So to figure out what my borders need to be, what I'm going to cut this to 14 3/4. What I want to do is to find the center of my block. So that's right here is the center of the block. And if this is a 12-inch block, that center is going to be 6 inches. Now, the overall finished size of the block needs to be 15¼ inches. So if I divide that by 2, that means that half of my block is 7 5/8. So if I take my 6-inch and I subtract it from 7 5/8, that leaves me with 1 5/8 of an inch. And what that means is that around the outside of my block, I am going to trim 1 3/8 of an inch. So I'm lining the 1 3/8 of the inch on the edge of my block, and I'm going to cut all the way around, and that will square my block up to 14 3/4. So there's 1 3/8. I'm going to turn it. I'm going to do 1 3/8. Now, if your block does not finish up to that exact size, you want to do that math in reference to whatever size your block finished up, because we're still going to have them 14 3/4. So it doesn't matter if your pieced block ends up being a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller than 12 inches. Let's just get that straightened up there. Got a little bit of a whoa. That's better. Okay, so let's just say, for an example, your block finishes up at 13 inches. 13 inches rough, so that would make it 12 1/2 inches. So then what you'll do, you're going to take whatever, let's grab my calculator. You're going to take whatever your special number is. So you're going to measure your block. So whatever that measurement is, we're going to divide that by 2. So let's say that your block ended up being 13 inches rough, so 12 1/2 inches once it's got the borders on it. So we're going to take 12 1/2, we're going to divide that by 2. So that gives us 6 1/4. Now we know we need the block to be 15 1/4 inches square. So half of that is 7.625, or 7 5/8. So we've got 12 1/2 divided by 2. That gives us 6 1/4. 15 1/4 divided by 2, which gives us 7.625. So we're going to take the 7.625, subtract your 6.25. That gives us a measurement of 1.375. So that is 1 3/8. So you will take your ruler, you'll line your ruler up at the 1 3/8 inch mark, and that is what you will cut around your borders, so that you end up with a 14 3/4 inch block when you're done. So there we go. That is it for this month. So it's been a really fun month. Well, they're always fun months. They're always really fun months. Look on the Facebook page for some fun facts on the color blue. And until next month, happy sewing!